Welcome to Pat O'Keefe's World of Curiosities, a podcast where we talk about all things mystical, magical, and mysterious. Hello, from high atop an Appalachian mountain, a portal opens to other dimensions. Welcome to Pat O'Keefe's World of Curiosities, where the focus of our program is to inform and educate the public about all things curious. Carrie is the co-founder of Indigo Psychics, and she is our guest tonight. She's been a practicing pagan since 1998. She was raised Catholic, but was introduced to places like Lilydale. And if any of you know anything about Lilydale, it is a magical place full of psychics and mediums and people who are open to the spiritual world. And she began reading tarot cards at a very young age. She was the founder of the first Wiccan study group at Langley Air Force Base in 2000 and is now a devout follower of the Old Norse Germanic path and continues to work professionally as a tarot reader. Carrie now lives in Appalachia and enjoys studying various European-rooted traditions of folklore, magic, and divination. Carrie, welcome to the world of curiosities.
Hey, thank you for having me. How are you?
Oh, I am so fine. Could you tell, put it into a synopsis, what your path entails? Because I know there's folks out there that aren't familiar with the Norse or the Northern tradition.
We really there's different labels for it. Asatru is one of the main movements, but I don't really subscribe to the ideology fully of Asatru. And then, you have Odinism, which it's I'm not an Odinist. I just call myself a heathen because there's a lot of similarities between the Norse and the Scandinavian paths or the Icelandic paths or the Norse or whatever, but my heritage is more German. And there's some differences, a little bit, not much, but I just love digging into not only the mythos of the Norse deities, but a lot of the old folklore, including Krampus, the Yule Cat, and that's pretty Scandinavian, and just kind of digging into what those people throughout that part of Europe were into, and a lot of them were, they were tribes. They were a lot of them were wandering tribes, and people think Norse, you think, oh, Vikings. Well, Viking was actually a verb. There were a lot of people who were very migratory, and traditions often blended between tribes. So it's interesting to see how that evolved over the years. And then a good example also is when you compare the Norse with Anglo-Saxon, you know. Um, I just love it. I just feel like I'm more connected to my ancestors when I read into that stuff, and I like working with runes. I do a lot of rune magic, you know. My space is very like limited for practicing. If I had like a, more than just a small apartment, I could have a, bigger setup, but I have something about the equivalent to maybe a small, just family dollar purchased stand for like $20. That's my altar.
Well, and people need to know you don't need to have a lot of fancy stuff. Whatever, it's really about the spirit. It's not about things. And when someone builds an altar, it's really putting things there that resonate with them, that helps them to with the spirits of or the gods or the god that they are following. But tonight's topic, we're going to be talking about the burning times and talking about the persecution of witches from the very early times, from about 1481 to now. And there is still persecution. In fact, now in certain parts of the world, there are hundreds of thousands of people that are being accused of witchcraft, and this is a very serious accusation. But I'd like to start right now with just going over very quickly the Witchcraft Acts. And the reason I want to do this is we often codify we put it into law so that it makes it very easy for us. to point at someone and say they are the other, and we have laws on the books in which we will punish those people. And we're going to start here with the Witchcraft Act of 1541. Now, we're looking at the historical succession of laws in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and the British colonies. And the reason I'm doing this, for many of us, we do have ties to the British Isles in some way. I mean, at one time, it was said that the British Empire, that the sun never set on the British Empire. So it really did touch many, many areas in the world. So the Witchcraft Act of 1541, good Henry VIII, he wasn't just about about trying to find a woman who could give him a healthy heir, and by heir I mean a male heir. He also was the first to define witchcraft as a so it went from being basically a misdemeanor to a death penalty. And not only that, the forfeiture of goods and chattels. What is chattel? Chattel is simply movable things that you own. In other words, it's not real estate. Now, it also removed the benefit of clergy. Now, what does that mean? That means if a member of the clergy were before then, if they were accused of witchcraft, then they could say, I'm not going to go to the common law courts. I wish to go to the church and be judged by the church. Now, that could be even harsher depending on who was in charge of that particular courtroom, so to speak, or judgment. Then we have the Witchcraft Act of 1562. Now, this is the act against conjurations, enchantments, and witchcrafts. This was actually enacted under Elizabeth I, and it was more merciful because it squarely put this in the common law. And it wouldn't take the life of a witch or someone accused of being a witch unless there was a loss of life. So just because your neighbor's cow died and they blamed it on you and you were accused in court, you wouldn't lose your life. So, which was a huge, huge upgrade, if you will, what had come before. Yeah, this is what I love about look at this. This is fascinating. Now we have indictments, okay, for homicide. And out of 1,158 homicides, 20% of them, almost 21% of them, were said to be from witchcraft. Now compare that to poisoning, only 31 cases. And here's another thing that's really interesting. Of the 157 people accused of homicide by witchcraft, only 9 of them were men, which is kind of average. It said during the entire burning times that 20% of those who were accused of witchcraft were men. So 80% women. Women have always taken the brunt of witchcraft accusations. And then we have the Scottish Witchcraft Act of 1563. And what that did, see, it added on, it wasn't just the witch, but those who consulted with the witch were also to be put to death. I mean, these were serious accusations. We had the Irish Witchcraft Act of 1586, which was largely identical to the English Witchcraft Act of 1562. And if you will remember, it was more merciful, it was in common law. Then we have the Witchcraft Act of 1603. Now, this is an act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits. So now what they're doing is piling on. It's not just about witches now. Now it's about those who interact, if you will, with the spirit realm in any way, which means you could be a medium and you could be with a what we would call a friendly spirit, a familiar spirit. You could still be convicted of witchcraft and put to death. So it's definitely another layer. Now this was done during James I's ascension to the throne of England, and Matthew Hopkins became the very self-styled witch finder general. This man struck fear into those who would encounter him or any of his henchmen, the witch finders, which were distributed all through Europe to root out the evil witches and any evil doers. And they did it without heart, and they did it with a very much methodically done. And the acts of Elizabeth and James changed the law of witchcraft. As we said, as a felony, accused witches were tried by common law. Burning at the stake was eliminated. This really is a relief. If you will read about ways to die, burning at the stake is burning at all. Fire is the most painful way that a human can die, but they felt it was necessary in their minds when they were burning witches at the stake in Europe, in that it purifies. See, the fire purifies, and in their minds, it kept the spirit of the witch from coming back and doing more damage. And the things that they would do were absolutely vicious. Like they might behead a witch, burn the body in effigy, and put the head on a spike on, say, a drawbridge or a bridge, as to others not to follow their lead, not to practice witchcraft. So it was eliminated. And then, except for petty treason, most people were hung now instead. All right. So you could still be burned, but only treason to the country in some way. The Witchcraft Act of 1603 is used in the British American colonies. Now, this is really interesting. We've always heard about William Penn. We're talking about Pennsylvania here. There was a court case, a Margaret Matson, and she was defended by William or acquitted by William Penn. So there's a lot to be said for this gentleman after her trial in Philadelphia in 1683. So we move on. Witchcraft Act of 1649, enforcement and extension of the Witchcraft Act of 1563. This ratified the existing Act of 1563 and extended it again to deal with consulters of evil and familiar spirits. And that could mean the death penalty. So again, it's just adding on. You're going from consulting spirits to even familiar spirits, okay? Those of your grandmother. Just if you heard her voice, keep it to yourself during that time. Women had to really, really oppress, and men who had gifts, oppress those gifts in order to put it bluntly, keep breathing. And then we had the Witchcraft Act of 1735. We finally, most people had grown out of this idea that there were all these women just sitting there, and men, 20% men, who were just killing people left and right by witchcraft. Now, this was like earth shaking. The penalties changed. The penalties replaced for the practice of witchcraft with those who, and I love this, the pretense of witchcraft. In other words, if you had someone that called themselves a witch, they were no longer immediately thought of as a true witch that would be lobbying like a death hex at their neighbor, right? It was a pretense. So now they were looked at as vagrants or con artists because there were a lot of very poor people who may do a poultice for someone or who may, work with somebody with the health, love, family, whatever it may be, using herbs and natural things around them, the air above them, the sun, whatever it is they had to work with. So now, see, it's changing. It's like a PR campaign. It's went from the omnipresent, powerful witch to you're a bum and a vagrant and a con artist. You see, either one is a winning combination for practitioners of any ilk. Now, I love this. Wow, for the whole of Great Britain, the 1563 and 1604 English acts were repealed with the enactment of the Fraudulent Medium Act of 1951. So no longer were you thought of as a witch, and you could be put to death, et cetera, or even given penalties for this. Now it went into the realm of law. So we have the Fraudulent Mediums Act. So now we have basically the government looking to see if what you're providing is fraudulent. And then the 1951 Act was finally appealed on May 26, 2008, and now it's really looked at as business practices and whether someone is taking advantage of someone else, whether someone really doesn't have talent, and we're going to talk about that today. It never seems like that person may be taken to task. But I wanted to go over those, and I'm going to hand this over to you so that you can give some comments about what you've just heard. And I know you already know this history.
Yeah. And as you were going on into the later part of what you were saying just now, it's like I'm thinking about the Commonwealth of Virginia right now. Right now, to be a tarot card reader, soothsayer, healer, spiritualist, et cetera, you got to buy a permit from the state. It's like $1,000 a year. And I think they're talking about raising that. There was, and correct me if I'm wrong, I should have brought up this article not too long ago. I think it was like last year or the year before. There was a lady who wanted to open an occult shop in Pennsylvania, and she got some guff from the local sheriff about that. Um, you know, Las Vegas, I think if you want to be a reader on the strip, I think you got to buy a permit. So it's still getting into business practices. To be a professional reader, a lot of these sites, including ours, for entertainment purposes only, right? So, I mean, there's like a huge liability to even have a business in this field. And now here in the United States, we do have grifters. I mean, we can't deny that. We have these grifters. Give me $600, I'll light a candle, bring your lover back. I mean, we often think about, scammers from overseas. No, there's a lot of them in the United States too. So it's like they're kind of, in a way, there's this essence of old laws that, from way back then, some of which are still on the books. And they kind of use that for modern day enforcement of the esoteric businesses.
Let me mention one thing though. There really are people that can use things like candles in order to create or manifest reality, like bringing a lover back. But I know what you're saying. Those who don't have that ability and are yet, they're advertising it and getting large sums of money for something that they know in the end is not going to manifest. And is it not true, Carrie, that these people we don't like? Most people who are true practitioners, it's hard to have warm and fuzzy feelings towards them, is it not?
It is very hard. Now, I know people that, they'll have an Etsy shop, they'll sell spells, whatever. But they tell you the results aren't always guaranteed, man. This is what you want to do, we can do this. But there's no guarantee, right? Because free will. You know what I mean? You have to understand magic. And what I tell people, I'm like, why don't you read into how to manifest this yourself? You know? And if you really feel you need an outcome, try to manifest it yourself. All of us know, no matter where our roots come from, there is a pre-Christian history in our ancestry. And I saw an ad for, it's like a zodiac app, and it was a girl. She's like, "How can you tell if you have witch's blood in your ancestry? Buy our app and run your chart and find out." And I'm like, just dig into your roots, man. Dig into your ancestry. You're gonna find probably a long line of Christians, sure, but it's pre-Christian Europe, right? For example, they weren't always Christian. We had the Druids. We had, these. people who lived in small tribes and had their own customs. They had their gods. Some of them had local gods that were only recognized locally. I mean, they celebrated the solstices. I mean, it was always there. And you're part of that because we are part of our ancestors. We have their DNA. So if you feel you need to turn to magic, try doing it yourself. Look into it. And maybe something's telling you that that's your calling to go back to your roots. That's just my two pennies on it.
No, I love your 2 pennies, and I agree completely. I will tell you that I saw a study that had been completed the other day, and I found it fascinating because I truly believe in genetic memory. And they were shocked because they have always science has always thought that memories were stored here. This is it. But they have found, in other cells that there's actually memory that is stored in those cells. So it doesn't surprise me. I mean, we are drawn to certain things. I mean, I've always been drawn to the Celts. And I've gotten my DNA results back, and of course, I'm from that region. But here's the thing, I'm 22% Germanic, and on top of that, I have a nice percentage of what they call Viking. And you're right, it was a verb. People in the Northlands would say, "Well, let's go a Viking," and that meant that we're going to do raids. We're going to do raids, bring back, women, because there was a dearth rather of women during that time. And so one of the reasons they wanted to go was to find farmland, find women, and set up camp. I mean, they were quite willing to blend into the society that they were with, even though they were conquerors. They were more than willing to become part of the landscape, which I think is beautiful. And they would oftentimes blend their religious and cultural backgrounds with what was already there. And that's why I truly believe they were so successful. My blood type is A negative, which is interesting because it's considered the blood type of the northern nations. I read that in a book called God's Graves and Scholars, which I found a fascinating read if anyone would like to do that. But anyway, yes, I agree with you. Now let's talk a little bit. Now I know that you know some of the ways that they would test witches during the day. What were some of those ways? And I'll put a list up.
Warts. They were looking for warts, certain types of birthmarks. I mean, they just kept piling onto that too. You know, if somebody, if somebody kept looking at somebody a certain way, or if they had, like, let's say, a lazy eye. I mean, it just, or God forbid, a mental illness.
Anything that would put them as the other, correct? Yes, yes. Yeah, one of
Hmm.
the famous ones, and I know you know this, there's an old saying, and it is, "Let God sort them out, so we won't worry who dies," right? And so the swimming test was a test that they would use, and they would dunk you, right? They would, dunk you often just on a seat, on almost like a seesaw, put you in the water, and sometimes you would accidentally drown, but they would tie your hands behind your back, and if you got away and swam, of course you would, to live, then you were definitely a witch. But if you drowned, then let God sort it out. You were obviously an innocent soul. And then there was the prayer test, which is really ridiculous because, and I will tell you why, because in the Salem witchcraft trials, George Burroughs said flawlessly the Lord's Prayer, and yet it mattered not. They went ahead and hung him. And what was their reasoning? It was a trick of the devil, even though it was considered in court to be an important piece of defense if you could recite flawlessly a prayer, right? And and then we have witches' marks like you were talking about. We have witch cakes. Tituba from Salem, Massachusetts is very famous. And supposedly it's countermeasure at magic, and you would use like the blood or urine of the supposed witch, right? You would put it with rye, you would mix it up and give it to a dog. And supposedly this counter witchcraft, which I find so ridiculous. Why would you use this, right? If you were out to get witches. But anyway, this dog would identify the person who was guilty. And it's really horrible too because they had Tituba do this, and yet they used it against her in her very own trial later in that particular witch craze. And then we have pricking and scratching. This makes me angry every time I see it. Supposedly witch marks, they would be numb, right? You couldn't really feel it. So, or they wouldn't feel it. So what they would do is they would take these, like, pins, and they would retract, so you really wouldn't feel it, right? Yeah, or they'd take dull needles, and sometimes they would just prick and scrape at somebody until they were bleeding all over the place. I mean, it was just awful. And then incantations, believe it or not, they might have a victim up there and say, "Okay, we'll let you go, maybe, if you call off the devil." And so the witch would stand up and say, "I rebuke thee, free Mrs. Thornbracken." And as soon as she did, this is a true story. As soon as she did, her name was Alice Samuel and her husband. As soon as she did that, the Throckmorton family, there were 5 daughters that were supposed to be under the spell. All of a sudden, they're miraculously okay, right? So they drugged the husband and wife and hung them. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then nocturnal visits. Supposedly, the witch could ride you, the hag, right? And remember Ann Putnam? She was 12 years old, and all of a sudden, this 12-year-old girl in a very misogynistic, s old Salem has all this power, and she actually said that, Goody Good had visited her at night and had tormented her, so nocturnal visits, and there are more. But these are just some of the ones that were common during that time.
Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, it is
And what's
sad.
even more sad is like some of the stuff is actually happening today in other parts of the world, where, like in parts of Africa, for example, you'll have these children that are accused of being possessed by witches because, let's say, you have a colicky baby or there's a toddler and they're terrible twos. And, some of these kids are tortured or they're just, you know, dumped in the middle of nowhere and just left. And it's scary that, that thought, that belief is still out there today in other parts of the world.
No, I agree. I want to, if I can, this is the first time I've done this, so if I'm not able to, just we'll keep going. But one of the things that I wanted to share with you, if I could, here it is. It's the witchcraft trial of Sarah Good. So I'm going to be sharing that with everyone. Now, Sarah Good was one of the first women to be accused of witchcraft during the Salem witchcraft trials, but this is what I wanted to show you. Now, she had a child of 4 years old, and Dorothy was just a child. The depositions accuse her of physically hurting and torturing the girls, a 4-year-old. So the deposition of Ann Putnam, who I would not want to have her karma to pay off in any lifetime, who testifieth and saith that on the 3rd of March, 1691-92, I saw the apparition of Dorothy Good. Now, Dorothy Good is Doris, she's 4. Sarah Good's daughter, who did immediately almost choke me and tortured me most grievously, and so she hath several times since tortured me by biting and pinching and almost choking me, tempting me also to write in her book. See, the book is the book where we sign our souls away, right? In her book, and also on the day of her examination, being the 24th of March, 1691-92, the apparition of Dorothy Good tortured me during the time of her examination and several times since. So this is a baby who is sent to prison. We are talking dungeons. I mean, there's no 3 meals a day here. So she is in jail for 7 to 8 months before being released. And as a result of the experience, she was never the same, according to the book, The Salem Witch Trials. Now, this is from that book. 18 years later, her father, William Good, was to write that she was in prison 7 or 8 months and being chained in the dungeon was so hardly used and terrified that she hath ever since been very chargeable. Now, what does that mean, chargeable? It means that someone had to take care of her 24 hours a day. Having little or no reason to govern herself, by very chargeable, there you go, he meant that financial burden because of that. So this is reality, what those trials meant. And you're right, the children that are involved. And in these African countries, they're often pointed at. And once they're pointed at, even the parents will forsake them. And you will find homeless children in the streets. It's just horrific.
Mm-hmm. And it's sad. I mean, there's wonderful organizations out there that have been trying to help those children, and take the orphans of discarded witch babies, quote unquote, and put them in, better environments. But I just, it's just like some parts of history just never died, you know, and it's horrible.
It is horrible. I mean, and, the thing about and this continued up until maybe the 1960s, where you could put your wife away for hysteria. And, again, it was like a modern day use of the other, right? Only instead of calling her a witch and putting her away, you would say, "Oh, she has the hysterics. She's hysterical, and therefore we're going to put her away." And he could sign her in and take off. Have you ever heard of a place called Randolph County Asylum? It's in Illinois. It's a beautiful old, you know, sanatorium or really asylum. And there was a woman, her name was Irene, I think, and she was actually dropped off. She had contracted syphilis from her salesman husband, and it was her salesman husband that had dropped her off in this place, which is oh, I know, and just horrific. And so but it was the same thing. There's a funny story, and it's really not funny, but there was a couple that actually turned on each other and accused each other of witchcraft. And what's fascinating about it is she ended up hung, I believe is what they did, and he got nothing. Nothing. Even though, the accusations were the same, which I found was fascinating in researching this.
It's so wild how, like, throughout history, like, witchcraft was always, like, directed or associated with the feminine spirit.
No. Well, it's the feminine power. And, I'm not taking anything away from male power. I mean, there's the power of the moon, which has always represented, not always, because there is an Egyptian god that represents the moon that is considered male. So not in all pantheons of gods as we try to understand the universe, but but usually the moon represents feminine energy. It represents, the hidden. It represents the quiet and peace. And we have the sun, which even the Egyptians had the great god Ra, which represented the sun and the power, the male power, that particular, source, which is the sun, which I always find fascinating. But anyway, and to wrap that little piece up, there are people who estimate, and I think this is way too high, that during the burning times that 9,000,000, up to 9,000,000 people lost their lives, most of those women in the Inquisition or the burning times. I think it's less than that, but I don't think it's as low as what like the very, very cautious researchers say, which is between 40 and 50,000, even though during that time the population was so low that even that would be catastrophic. In one witch hunt, they took out 20% of the women in that region. Let that set in. So that's a lot of people. That is yes, yes. Yes, absolutely, and we have a comment, I'm gonna put it up because I think that's very good. So much of it was a way to suppress and control women. Comment?
I would have to agree. I also feel like there was a whole lot of superstition that went into that too, and what led to that, you know. It's like the two went hand in hand, and this is kind of what we got. Um and this is why I'm all for separation of church and state.
Mhm. No, our forefathers saw that. Look, they came over here on boats getting away from persecution, religious persecution. The last thing they wanted at that time was to say, this is a Protestant country, that's all it is. I've never felt that from the founding fathers. It was more, we're escaping this ourselves, and we want to be more open to living free in a free country, and that includes our religion. Let's see, well, I have read that, but I also know the times and the way that people are raised and how religion, especially during that time, was a very important part of the landscape, and it was part of the reason that they did escape their homeland because that's what it was. So I don't know. I agree. Historians argue this amongst themselves. I have no idea. I have my own thoughts on that. Simply being a human being and knowing the influence of society on us, but I also know they picked up and ran. So there is that. Julie has a question for you. Do either of you think that those types of witch hunts could or would ever occur in the United States again?
No, no, I don't. And we've come such a long way. Now, is there going to be discrimination out there? Absolutely. Like, that's, not something that we can control. People are going to think what they think. But over the course of the past 10, 15 years, you also have to look at the progress that we made. You know, when I first entered the United States military, it was 1998. And Wicca had just gotten recognized as a DoD religion not too long before that. So then you got all these other pagan faiths that were recognized. And then you got, especially mine, also true heathenry. That was one of the more recent ones over the past few years. Then they started making accommodations. Like people of the Norse path, they could grow a beard while being in active service. And then, we also have this beautiful thing called the First Amendment, right? And I really do not think that it would ever get to the level that it once was back then because of federal protections. Um, and also, if you look at the mainstream, the craft, paganism, with, Wicca, all these other esoteric practices, what even if it's, manifestation, it's kind of mainstream now. So even in North Carolina, encountering some of the Christians around here, they've been actually kind of nice. I mean, you're gonna have your butt heads out there. I mean, there's butt heads in our community, but I really don't think that we're ever going to have to face that kind of a nightmare. I really don't.
And I certainly hope not. I will tell you that, one of the things that all of us have to be careful of is to maintain our rights to freely express ourselves. I truly believe that freedom of expression is up there. We have to protect that. because that helps to guarantee a freedom of religion in the way that we express ourselves. And I want to close out, this section because we're going to go more into the now after this because we're going to talk about some of the things, some of the issues that we're concerned about as far as right practicing in the here and now. But I wanted to end with this because this is so this will tear your heart out, but it's so apropos to end this particular segment. There is an Irish children's rhyme, and it goes, "Are you a witch or are you a fairy or are you the wife of Michael Clary?" And I show her face there. She is one of the last people to die, and certainly maybe the last person to die being accused of either witchcraft or being a fairy. There is something called a changeling in fairy lore, where they will come and get your healthy baby and deliver a sick one of their sick ones in exchange. So they're called changelings. His wife, Bridget, she was née Bridget Boland, born February 1869 in County Tipperary, Ireland. So her husband was older than her. She was very independent. She was always very well dressed. She was a well-known seamstress. So she got ill. Well, he said that she was a changeling, that she was not his wife. And so he began to torture her. I mean, even members of her own family bought into this and helped him torture her. They actually put her into a fire, right? They took branding, a brand, and branded her with it from the fire. And so they were really busy torturing this poor woman who just happened to be sick. And then all of a sudden she disappears. Well, they do look for her because people in small community, people want to know where you are. And when they found her, they found a body that after examination had not only been tortured, but had been burnt to death. In the court case later, it was found that he had thrown, like, oil all over her from a lamp and had lit her on fire. And yet 8 people kept their mouth shut who knew what had happened to this poor woman. So she died not only being accused, she was being accused of being a fairy, but also with the taint of witchcraft. He got 15 years for this. And some of the reasons that they say he might have done this, because it was never very clear, was that she was an independent woman who had her own money and that he was threatened by her. Another is that she was having a secret affair, which there was, from what I read, really no indication of that. So who knows what happened with this woman? But think of this, when she died, it was 1895. That's 15 years before, or 20 years before my grandmother was born. I mean, that close to us. So with that, we're going to leave the past and we're going to come to the present because I know we're interested in talking about that, Carrie. So I'm going to open that up to you.
I don't think we're going to revert back to, witch hunts in this country. I really don't. We've made a lot of progress, and religious tolerance, especially, if you work in the federal sector, that is something they don't take lightly. There's been several, court cases for like Virginia Supreme Court, for example, years and years ago. A Wiccan high priestess out of, I think it was somewhere out near Richmond. Correct me if I'm wrong, but she wanted the right to do hand fastings, and she sued the Commonwealth. So I do think that we are in a time where I think we're going to be okay. I do think that our community, because we don't have like this higher entity that tells us what we can and can't do, like the Catholics have the Vatican. um we don't really have that higher organization to really kind of police us. So we do kind of have to, quote unquote, look out in our own community too. We have some very good groups out there. We have some amazing people out there that are teaching people, that are mentoring people, doing podcasts, writing books, and you can buy a lot of craft supplies, like in the mainstream now. But we also have this other part of our community too, that our way or the highway. You're not doing it right. We're gonna, and my heart goes out to the Christian witches out there, and that is a thing. you know those guys get a lot of guff from both sides of the fence, from Christianity and other witches, because they found a certain power within Christianity that resonates with them as well as the craft. um I think it just boils down to, we need to be kinder to each other. And if we see something going on in our communities that does not look good, when it comes to abuse, neglect, stuff like that, or grifters, we need to collectively call that out, and not just, turn the other cheek and try not to pay attention to it, because in the end it makes us look bad. Makes us look bad just like that preacher's looking bad, you know? And have discussions about people with people. I'm not saying push our faith on anybody, but people are curious. Have that open discussion of what we are, and who we are and what we're about. And don't judge anybody, for what path they want to follow. you know Point them in the right direction to resources and stuff. I mean, I think that's kind of how we keep moving forward.
Well, what is your best advice that you could give someone that's just curious about, uh, the neo-pagan path? Which I really have a problem with that too, because I feel, and I think you definitely do, that I want to reach back to the ancestors to experience what they experienced as far as spirit. It's interesting. I was on TikTok earlier today, and I don't usually go there, but I was, and I noticed there were a lot of people saying that the goddess Hecate was, or Hecate, or Hecate, because I've heard it pronounced so many different ways, but that she is reaching out to people, and the number of TikTokers that were saying the same thing, I thought was pretty interesting. It could be that I just fed into the algorithm where I stopped to listen to the first one, I was getting the second one, but I found it interesting.
I've actually noticed that too, and I'm not really a follower of that goddess. I feel she's interesting, but I've noticed a lot of people have been kind of like veering towards her for whatever reason. Freya is she's my patron as goddess. I'll always be devoted to Freya. But even I too have, felt the need to kind of look into who Hecate is. I mean, it's, I think people feel that energy of change, you know, and there's different aspects to that goddess. And then for whatever reason, she speaks to them, you
Mhm.
know?
Well, Hecate is interesting to me because for those that don't know, she is the triple-faced goddess, or triple-headed, however you want to imagine it, but it's basically one face here, and here. And she represents Maid Mother Crone in different aspects of a woman's life, but she rules over the crossroads. She rules over the underworld. She rules over, and by underworld, I mean the doorway to the underworld. She kinda like Baron Samedi that way, right? And she is also the patron goddess of witches, which, most people who practice anything are sometimes simply drawn to her regardless whether or not she's in their historical path, which I find also interesting.
Yeah. I mean, what calls to you. You don't have to follow, the ways of your ancestors. I just tell people that's a good starting point, you know. You don't
Mhm,
have to, like, oh, well, I don't know if I should go over here because that's not in my ancestry. No, if it calls to you, go for it.
mhm. I absolutely agree. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we begin to wrap up?
Um Well, if anybody, is interested and you like coffee, visit, indigopsychicscoffee.com. We got some great flavors. We got some witchy themed stuff over there. We got some tea, and if you want a psychic reading, we got some great readers on board.
And I will tell you that
Is it okay? I did
having
ask you first. I'm sorry.
No, no, no. That's exactly what I was looking at is, did you have anything that you wanted to share? And I will tell you from personal experience, they were kind enough to actually provide coffee for a seance that we had. We had a seance in high tea, and it was the bomb. Everyone bragged about it. So, and that, yes, it was wonderful. We did get a short little clip of that and, a little ad and had gotten that to you all, but yes, so their teas truly are amazing. I can speak from firsthand experience. And also, is there any way that someone could get in touch with you if they just wanted to connect?
You can email me at indigopsychics.coffee at outlook.com. Not Hotmail, Outlook.
Okay,
I get
okay,
too confused, but it's indigopsychics.coffee at outlook.com.
alright.
I try to keep my social media in my, more personal circles these days. Um,
I could tell that. I mean, and you know what? Almost have to. I'm gonna show this just so people can take a gander real quick before we move on. And this is one of their pages. It is Artisan Tea, and you'll see their logo up there. So, yes, if you have a hankering, as we say in the country and on the mountain, for tea, then you may be very interested in this. And they also, as she said, they also have psychics that you can connect with through her company, which I find fascinating. Now, I just want to say a couple things. I do have a new book out. It is called Lunar Manifesting, right here. Yeah, hardback, and it is Moon Magic, Mirror Magic, and the Witch's Ladder. It's a small read. It's not a super thick book, so it's really nice if you just want some answers about how to connect these types of magic with, say, crystals or herbs, that sort of thing. So short, sweet. Also, the time of the month. Is it a full moon? Is it a new moon? Whatever, how you would connect your magic to that. Or if you were a very religious person, more in the Christian way or Christian, but with a very spiritual, connection, it may be that you want to connect the phases of the moon with the types of prayers that you do. So that, and also just to let everyone know, I just got back from Florida. I did some extensive training in forensics hypnosis, which I'm extremely thrilled about. Yeah, it's a type of hypnosis that they use in investigatory, way with police in order to be able to hypnotize someone and be able to recover memories. And for anyone that knows me, they know recovered memories and past lives is where I focus my practice. So anyway, thank you all for being with us. We are thrilled that, you all have joined us tonight. Thank you all. You have no idea how much this means to me. Yes, absolutely, Carrie. And tune in next Thursday night at 8 p.m. for Pat O'Keefe's World of Curiosities. Until then, stay witchy and wonderful.
Good night, everyone.
Night, Carrie.